Welcome to the Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures podcast. Our goal is to bring to light new stories, new perspectives on mountain landscapes and mountain communities around the world with help from a wide range of expert guests, including exciting new academic research on mountain history and some amazing work by creative practitioners engaging with mountain landscapes in a range of different media. I'm Jason König from the University of St Andrews.
And I'm Jonathan Westaway from the University of Lancashire.
It's a huge pleasure today to welcome Caroline Schaumann. Caroline is Professor of German Studies at Emory University. She's one of the world's experts on the history of exploration and mountaineering, especially in the 19th century, and combines that with an interest in ecocriticism and the environmental humanities, which we may hear more about later. Her 2020 book, Peak Pursuits, The Emergence of Mountaineering in the 19th Century, offers a reassessment of the history of exploration and mountaineering in the 19th century, covering the Andes, the Alps, and the Sierra Nevada. She's published on a huge range of other topics in mountain history, volumes on mountains in German literature and culture from the medieval world to the present. Recently, a volume, for example, on global mountain cinema, published earlier this year. Caroline is also a keen climber herself, and I'm hoping we'll hear a little bit about that in today's episode. Welcome, Caroline. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast series, Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to be speaking more about my research.
Maybe we could start just by asking you, how did you come to work on mountains as a researcher? I'd be interested to know also how far your own personal experience of mountains are part of that story. Has your personal engagement with mountains helped to shape those research interests in any way?
Yes, as you already mentioned, I'm a very passionate climber myself, and you're absolutely right that my personal engagement with mountains is shaping my research to a considerable degree. And perhaps this is something that comes naturally to us as academics, where it's often really difficult to draw a dividing line between work and your personal interests. But ironically, West Berlin, the city where I grew up, is notoriously lacking in mountains. So you might know that the highest mountain there is only a hill that rises about 80 meters. It's called the Teufelsberg, the Devil's Mountain. And moreover, is actually made up entirely from debris and rubble of World War II, which is, of course, a very interesting story in itself. And when I grew up, climbing gyms were not yet in existence. So my now 103-year-old great aunt takes credit for my mountain interest, since she took the family to yearly summer hiking trips to Switzerland when I was a child. I truly became interested in rocks and mountains when I was visiting California in my early 20s, and I saw rock climbers for the very first time in Joshua Tree National Park. After I moved to California, I began scrambling and then rock climbing myself in Yosemite National Park. This was in the early 1990s. And back then, climbing was quite a different sport. It was much more exclusive, was male-dominated, and it was also not as accessible, since it required quite a bit of very expensive gear and equipment. But I was immediately hooked by this physical contact with the rock in such beautiful surroundings. And this fascination and this pull still holds true today. I believe that rock climbing is a sport where you really become part of the environment rather than just being a spectator. And this really physical closeness to the rock and the sense of touch contributes significantly to this experience that differs, I think, from just merely seeing nature, let's say on a hike. And also very important is that this is a sport that one practices with partners, unless you are free soloing, which I am not. So my closest relationships and friendships have developed through rock climbing, which also includes my husband and our now 11-year-old daughter.
Fantastic. It's really interesting to hear, actually, that your rock climbing interests are an American interest, actually, rather than a European interest, at least initially, and how they originated. Do you get time to climb still today, or is it harder to get out on the rocks?
Yeah, it's mostly confined here in Atlanta, is again a rather flat place, so there is good rock climbing nearby in gorges. But I'm mostly nowadays doing the work week climb in the gym, and I'm actually very grateful for this opportunity. And in some ways, I think it is a much more environmentally sustainable place to be for a lot of rock climbers, since rock climbing has so exploded in popularity.
And have you had the chance to climb on some of the routes you've written about in your own work? Is that something that's been important to you?
Good question. Not as much in Switzerland, in the Alps, unfortunately. But it's still really nice, of course, to have something on your bucket list. But in North America, yes. And it is really wonderful to be able to relate to the routes in this way, but not all, unfortunately, still to come.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, we might hear a bit more about that later as we go on. Maybe we could just move on now to your book. I mentioned the Peak Pursuits book. Perhaps you could just start by giving us a summary of what you're trying to achieve in the book and how did you come to work on that project, basically?
I was really amazed to find some of my own experiences in the mountains mirrored in the narratives of male 19th century mountaineers, and as well also as finding some important differences. So Alexander von Humboldt talks incessantly about the sensation of his body, and he keeps measuring the sensation. And he also, of course, keeps measuring his environment. Also, the alpinist and naturalist Horace Benedict de Saussure recalls a formative experience when, as a young boy, he touched rocks on a scramble and says this was really an important experience for him, this experience of touch. And then we have the Briton Leslie Stephen, who really famously described his climbing as an activity involving hands, feet, knees, and eyelids. So you see really this physical element in these narratives. But then I also saw substantial differences and some troubling aspects in their texts, as these males were writing from a position of privilege and they often promoted exclusivity. So I felt that the complexity and the contradictions that I had encountered had not been sufficiently addressed, yet they still bear relevance in how we encounter mountains today. And so likewise, I thought that the interactions and reciprocal influences among this group of naturalists, scientists, and mountaineers had not been the subject of in-depth analysis, but shed light on transnational impacts and storied routes between Europe, North America, and South and Central America. So you could maybe say that my aim was threefold: to reassess these well-known figures anew to see what perspectives their texts can provide to the present moment, and then also to highlight the troubling aspects in the complexity of their visions, and then to draw attention to these reciprocal influences and impacts.
Fantastic. Thanks. Yeah, and one of the things I love about the book is the way it shuttles between the European and the American history of mountaineering and drawing out the common threads, but also some of the differences between them as well. Thank you.
Can we dig a bit into the theoretical framing of the project, Caroline? You mentioned text, but also archives are very, very important. I know that one of your other areas of interest is ecocriticism and the environmental humanities. So how important is that for your work on mountains, and how do you use it as a vehicle for unlocking new perspectives on the history of mountains and mountaineering? And at one point in the book, you talk about mountaineering as an intimate exchange between the human and the more than human world. And you've already touched on that embodied practice, in your own experience of climbing. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. This brings me back thinking about Jason's earlier question, again, about the routes I have climbed or not climbed. So ironically, some of those routes are pretty much unclimbable now because of climate change. So those routes that were originally deemed very safe and the easiest, the best faces, are now, because of the sun exposure and rockfall, considered extremely dangerous. I'm thinking of the route on Mont Blanc, for instance. But so as climbers traverse these fragile mountain regions, they witness and really take part in the ongoing damages to the natural environment, also from issues of garbage to human waste, to, again, the effects of climate change, to very specific impacts of climbing, such as drilling bolts and anchors into the rock, to chalk on rock faces, or also damaging the vegetation from bouldering mats. And at the same time, climbers really crucially depend on this natural environment for the recreation, for their sport, and I would also argue for their general well-being. So in some ways, I believe this situation mirrors the human condition in the Anthropocene, where humans are at once, we are masters and we are also victims of the natural world. We are impacting every inch of this earth, but we are at the same time severely impacted by climate change and pollution. And so climbers are really at the front lines of experiencing both, since their sport is so tied to the rock faces that also at the same time provide nesting habitats for hawks, surface areas for lichen and moss, in places that were often fairly undisturbed before the climbers came. But as you mentioned, Jonathan, I do believe that climbing offers this direct physical contact with this more than human world. And this is a really powerful experience, and an experience which I believe ties to some of our innate instincts and drives, such as the power of grip or the fear of falling. And this also contributes to the increasing popularity of climbing. As I said, I see this already outlined in the 19th century narratives, and believe that this immediate contact with the material environment provides us with this crucial experience of our own bodies, then also the natural worlds, and also human histories, cultures, and connections. This grounds the theoretical framing of my book in the environmental humanities, and specifically in ecocriticism, that is, the relationship between humans and their environment in a given text. And then maybe also more specifically, material ecocriticism, so looking at the physical and bodily interactions with nature. And as such, my work seeks to highlight the importance of these intertwined experiences and the need to also safeguard these experiences in the future, and the demand to adapt to a changing world.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it, for the climbing community who, inevitably consume the global commons, but, also campaign to preserve it as well. There's a constant tension, isn't there, between our desire for access and the damage that we can do. Can we turn to Alexander von Humboldt? Because he's very prominent in the book, and he's a figure we've touched on with some of our other guests, but it would really help to talk to you to kind of unpack his significance in the early 19th century. He has a very prominent role in your first two chapters, and then serves as a kind of leitmotif throughout the rest of the book. Are there ways in which you think your account helps us see his achievement in new ways? I was very struck by the fact that you mentioned that a lot of his accounts of mountaineering were never actually published in the translated works, but actually remained in diaries and letters, which you've accessed in the archive. So I'd really like to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about Alexander von Humboldt. As you rightly say, he is really not only a key figure in my book, but provides the framework and pretty much the entire setup. And it's really interesting that you are mentioning Humboldt's achievements, because what I see among the most significant facets about Humboldt are actually his non-achievements, and that is his articulation of failure. And so I mean failure in the sense of experiencing bodily fatigue, the physical afflictions at altitude, and the interferences he encounters in his body, but also failure of his instruments that constantly fail, and frustration, general frustration in this act of measuring. But also, and this is important too, a failure in reaching a summit. And so most prominent here, of course, is Humboldt's turning around on Mount Chimborazo at a crevasse about 700 meters from the summit. And I believe this experience of failure is a very modern one. And going further, it really opens the door to a new, and I would argue more important, experience in mountaineering and climbing that focuses on the process and on the movement rather than the end goal of reaching a summit. So reframing this summit position, and this is also, of course, something our colleague Peter Hansen has written about, becomes really exceedingly important in contemporary mountaineering. Giving up the summit position literally levels the playing field, and it opens new perspectives and achievements in mountaineering, and diminishes the importance of ableism, privilege, and superiority. So I see Humboldt at the very beginning here. And I believe that giving up the summit position provides a much more useful model for mountaineering than what immediately followed Humboldt, which was the 20th century race for the summits and its nationalistic tinge.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. One thing that really struck me about your account of Humboldt was his homosexuality and the fact that even amongst scholars today, potentially, that's still quite controversial. We know that empire provided not only opportunities for exploration of physical places, but for new ways of being in the world, and particularly exploration of sexuality. So, for instance, the French Empire, First Republic, decriminalized homosexuality, and consequently, for European gay men, French colonial North Africa was a haven, a desired space. You also mentioned that a lot of his intimate personal correspondence was destroyed subsequently. Could you say a bit about how significant you think his sexuality was to the type of science he was doing? The French talk about the savant sensible, the rational person who is also the feeling person, and that is the way in which you kind of access truth. And that seems to me to describe Humboldt, but I'd love to get your perspective.
It is pretty clear that he was homosexual and kind of from the beginning in his early youth wanted to really escape this restrictive Prussian environment, which he was going in and then growing up. And it seemed like his voyages, and he was, of course, dreaming of a grand voyage, again, from his early youth. And it didn't matter so much at first where, but the more important point was to get away. It was maybe a way to, at first, escape the restrictive society of his time, but also possibly to gain more freedom in his sexuality. So mountains as this queer space is a significant aspect, I think, that comes to bear not only in Humboldt. And Humboldt then on his trip in Ecuador, he encountered a 22-year-old male, Carlos Montufar, and he chose to take Montufar along on his travels for the remainder of his voyage. And rather than some very well-established naturalists in South America, and this of course angered in some ways the community and really fueled a lot of rumors about their relationships. And Montufar even came with Humboldt afterwards to Paris and lived with Humboldt after the journey. But I think you also see that, as you mentioned, Jonathan, it's not just Humboldt. You see that in other 19th century mountaineers in my book, as for instance, John Tyndall, Edward Whymper, and Clarence King. They all relate nights with their male companions at very close quarters where the homosocial really slips into the homoerotic. But I do also want to take it to the 21st century and give credit to my colleague Ralph Poole, who just contributed a really excellent chapter in our Global Mountain Cinema that I want to highlight, because what Poole worked out, and he discusses really in more detail films like Brokeback Mountain and other contemporary films, is how this mountainous environment offers, on the one hand, a remote space for queer sexuality, but also in some ways, especially now in our contemporary age, continues the shame and fear of a closeted life, as well as the common stereotypes about homosexuality and bestiality and wild nature. So I think these tensions are really worth highlighting also in the earlier narratives and depictions. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's something I hope we can come back to and talk about in the future in these podcasts. Just one last question, if I may. You talked about Humboldt embracing failure and incorporating failure into his narratives. When we talked with Lachlan Fleetwood recently about the emergence of the idea of altitude as a kind of almost epistemic value in scientific practice at the time, of course, everybody was concerned about who got the highest. And for a long time, Humboldt thought he had the altitude record. And yet now we know, of course, through archaeology from people like Johann Reinhardt and the mummies of Yuyayako, that the Inca had incorporated these summits into their political and religious practice, that they were going up to 20,000 feet, 22,000 feet. I just wondered, would Humboldt have been disappointed, or would he have very quickly have kind of assimilated that data?
Very good. I think he was still very duly proud of his measurements and achievements. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for bringing that up, because I have to say that I took, in this case, Humboldt's words too much at face value. that this is also perhaps an issue that is not sufficiently treated in my book, but it is indicative of the priorities of Western mountaineering. And again, the summit position that, as you say, Humboldt always claims to have been the first and climbs the highest, even when he does not reach the summit. He is still very, very proud of his so-called altitude record, which is now proven untrue. This also comes to bear, and this maybe also sheds light on your question, Jonathan. Again, in my chapters on the American West and Clarence King assumes to be climbing the highest mountain in the continental US. Now we call it Mount Whitney, but it turned out he was actually on another mountain. And on top, he was on top of Mount Langley. And on the top, he sees a cairn and he sees an arrowhead. But that doesn't distract him from his pride of being the first white man to have climbed to the top. And he actually leaves a note to that effect. So we do have this history of appropriation and also erasure. And on the other hand, as you point out, we have histories of inhabiting and living with the mountains that need to be uncovered and illuminated. And Jason, actually, I also had a peek at your book, and I'm truly grateful for your work on the mountains of antiquity, because there we also see the different ways of how the inhabitants actually used summit.
Absolutely, yeah. Really long history, of course, in the Mediterranean world of pre-modern engagement and climbing to summits. That's fantastic, Caroline. Yeah, I wonder if we could move on maybe and look at some of the Alpine sections of the book as well, and just leave a bit of time for that. And maybe it's a good opportunity just to dig into some of the stories and to hear a bit more about some of the individuals you're writing about in those books. I wondered whether actually looking at Edward Whymper would be a good place to do. You mentioned Whymper very briefly earlier on. For those who don't know, Whymper first to climb the Matterhorn, 1865, with his companions. Of course, his scrambles amongst the Alps has been such a famous, controversial text in mountaineering history. I suppose it's arguably the single most important work in the history of mountaineering literature, or at least alpine mountaineering literature. So I wonder, how does a figure like Whymper look different when we come to look at his work through the frameworks that you're providing us with, this framework of embodied experience?
Whymper is interesting because he's also so much more complex than seems at first sight. Because as you said, Jason, he's of course remembered first and foremost as a tragic conqueror of the Matterhorn, and then also this infamous accident when 4 people died on the descent because a rope broke, and this moment really defined his life ever after. And moreover, he is really depicted as being at the precipice of modern climbing, with a foremost interest in reaching the summits rather than pursuing scientific research, and also a language, and you do see that in Scrambles in the Alps, a language that betrays sexism, prejudice, and nationalism. Yet I would not really draw this dividing line quite as clearly as one can also see when one compares Whymper with John Tyndall, who's an Irish scientist who also betrayed many similar traits. So Whymper is far more complex. As one of the few climbers, he actually did not grow up privileged, but he started out as a wood engraver and an illustrator. Yet he was extremely well-read, and he knew certainly very much about science in the mountains, and often referred to Humboldt, and also followed Humboldt's footsteps in the Andes and climbed to the top of Chimborazo. But moreover, this maybe gets to more what you're asking about, Jason. His text and his illustrations are really replete with a rather unheroic obsession with falling and failing again. So you see all these falling bodies. And so they're decidedly not summiting, but they are fearful, they're fragile, and they're falling. So I think there is a confession of vulnerability here that has been underestimated.
Great, yeah, including his own body, of course, falling. It lets several images of himself falling. I sometimes wonder too whether there's a kind of intimacy in those images, the engraved images, the act of engraving, which gets you so close up to the texture of the materials that you're working with, which is maybe parallel with somehow the kind of embodied engagement with the rock and the mountainside that he's so interested in.
Oh, I love that. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, the very physical act of engraving and interacting, yes, as you're doing a woodcut. Very good.
Let's have a look very briefly too, if you would, on the final chapter of the book, which turned then to the North American mountaineering exploration history. I just wondered if you could tell us just a little bit about those chapters. And I'm very much aware that the book, in a sense, mirrors your own trajectory from Europe to America. did you have questions in the back of your mind as you wrote those chapters about the ways in which mountains matter in North American culture today, in your own experience?
Yeah, interesting that you say that, because it wasn't so much the back of my mind at the time, but yet, of course, it was somewhat striking to encounter so many immigrants and also so many Americans going back to Europe for longer periods of time for their research or their studies. So it was truly revealing to see these reciprocal influences of European and North American naturalists and mountaineers. John Muir, of course, was an immigrant from Scotland, and while he's often credited with the conceptualization of the American wilderness, he also carried this distinct European mindset, often with cruel consequences. As has become known, he imagined this American quintessential wilderness as pure and clean, but ironically without its indigenous inhabitants, such as the Yosemite Miwok. And he remained quite oblivious to their ongoing genocide and participated also in the white settlement of Indian lands by working in the logging and in the construction business in Yosemite. So this is a little bit less known. And moreover, Muir really adopted and preached these very European models of forest management, such as the prevention of forest fires, which then had a lasting effect on U.S. forest management and tragically made these forest fires in California and in general in the American West far more destructive to this day. So I think there's also a little bit of a cautionary tale here in perceiving landscapes and cultures with one's own preconceived notions. But of course, also it was really illuminating for me to see how the American approach to wilderness was influenced by European models.
Fantastic. Can we look a bit beyond Peak Pursuits now at some of the other amazing projects that you've been working on? Could you tell us a bit more about the mountain cinema volume that you mentioned earlier on? I mean, I'm really interested in kind of early expeditionary film. I've just been working on John Knoll's 1922 climbing Mount Everest film, you know, the first film ever shot in Tibet. Your book engages with a lot of 20th century mountain and mountaineering cinema, much more recent films. So how do you see the state of play in terms of mountain cinema and film? What would you say are the recent trends and the most exciting developments and possibilities of mountain film?
Jonathan, I hope there will be a follow-up volume that you can be part of, because that surely sounds like a fascinating project. And indeed, I mean, that is maybe the main point of this volume, is that it is meant to be a beginning in opening up the field rather than the book on global mountain cinema. The goal of this volume was to move these beyond these established categories of the so-called German mountain film, the Berg film of the 1920s and 30s. So this is a really well-defined genre that emerged in response to World War I and celebrated manhood and mountain conquest. And many of the directors and actors, such as Arnold Funk, Louis Trenker, and Leni Riefenstahl, then continued their careers more or less successfully in Nazi Germany. This Berg film has really dominated the reception of mountain movies in German-speaking countries, especially. So we hope to resituate mountain cinema in a much broader transnational context. So in this way, as you already mentioned, Jonathan, our volume pays attention to earlier films, but also other film traditions, such as the Norwegian mountain films, but also transcultural film negotiations, such as the representations of the Alps in Bollywood or in Chinese cinema. And one chapter looks at digital technologies in the climbing documentaries Free Solo and The Alpinist. Another one looks at the ski comedy, and another one looks at mountains in the video game Death Stranding. And I think I also already mentioned Rolf Pool's contribution. So, of course, our coverage is by no means comprehensive, but we are hoping to open up these traditional, very Eurocentric, focused categories based on this so-called Alpine model that really take the Alps as a yardstick for other mountain ranges across the globe.
That's so exciting to hear, because there's so much work to be done on mountain film, I think. I was lucky enough to see the late, great Pema Sadin's Snow Leopard recently. He's a Tibetan filmmaker, great Tibetan filmmaker.
Yeah.
And, the center of that mountain film project is a kind of eco-criticism within a very repressive environment in which to make films. So mountain films from Asia and the global south as well is something I think there needs to be a lot more work on. So one of the projects you're involved in is a volume that I'm working on with Jason and with Jonathan Pitches about mountain objects, where the goal is to take a fresh look at the history of mountains and mountaineering through a close engagement with a series of different objects. And this is going to be a book that draws in a lot of different contributors exploring different objects from mountain history in turn. Would you be willing to talk a bit about the object that you've chosen for your contribution?
Yeah, of course. It's such a fascinating project. I'm really thrilled to begin working on this. And my contribution looks at the barometer, which was used to determine a mountain's elevation in early Western mountaineering. So this actually brings us back to Humboldt and other 19th century. So mountain barometers, to maybe explain this first, were these long glass tubes that were filled with mercury, and then they were encased in brass and in wood, and also outfitted with a leather strap so that it could be carried. As you can imagine, they were extremely cumbersome and very, very heavy. They measured the air pressure, which is, as we know, reduced at altitude via this mercury column that was held up by air. So these barometers were already developed in the 17th century and came into wider use in the mountains in the 18th century. So the first ascensionist on Mont Blanc carried a barometer, Haque and Balmat, and then later Saussure and Balmat also hauled not one, but actually two barometers when they ascended Mont Blanc in the next year in 1787. And Saussure, I really love this, referred to the barometer as the old man, constant, but also very annoying and cumbersome companion.
Temperamental.
And Alexander von Humboldt constantly speaks about the barometer as well, and his troubles with the barometer most of all, because obviously it had to be carried, then it had to be unwrapped, it had to be handled extremely carefully, and then it had to be elaborately set up.
How big were these barometers, Caroline? What kind of scale are we talking about?
Yeah, I want to say about a meter.
Right, so pretty substantial. So you can see why that's a lot of hassle to carry this carcass along with you. Yeah, great.
Especially if you consider all the weight, right? And the brass and the wood.
Yeah, pretty heavy. Okay.
But I think what's also interesting, we talked about this already a little bit. This barometer then served as the so-called proof of the altitude records in Western mountaineering. And an extension now makes us wonder about the climbers who did not measure their heights. So what again does it erase? And I'm very interested in this continued, I think, Western obsession with measuring that we have to this day with altimeters, GPS watches, and now, of course, it's fitness tracking devices that have replaced the barometer because the mercury in barometers is no longer legal.
Are there any other ways in which mountains play a role in your future research plans? What opportunities do you see for future work in the field? What directions would you like to go in terms of mountain research?
Yeah, so of course there are many more mountains to climb in the future. And I am just beginning in the very early stages of working on a new monograph that would examine the life and the work of the scientists, explorers, and the mountaineers, the Schlag and White brothers, in the second half of the 19th century. And they went to the Alps, the Himalaya, and then later Robert Schlag and White to the Californian Sierra Nevada. So again, you have very transnational aspect here. And that was also interesting to me, Jonathan, because in other Everests, you actually mention Emil Schlag and White in the introduction, who was, of course, the younger brother, and you mention him in the context of naming the mountain Everest. So I am in my work more interested in the three older brothers, and I'm really intrigued by the contradictions and the complications that emerge from their mission. They wrote extensively the Schlagenweits. We have a lot of sketches and photographs that provide insights in these emerging imperial sciences, but at the same time, they really challenge one-sided historiographies. What is so interesting about their journey is that it was funded by actually 3 governing powers in 3 different states. So the British East India Company paid for their journey, which then also became increasingly controversial. But the Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm IV, due to Humboldt's support, was also giving some support. And moreover, King Maximilian of Bavaria, which is where they grew up, said that he would give the Schlagenweits a position at a Bavarian university after they returned. So he also supported this journey. So as one can see, this is a pretty precarious setup, and the expedition's aim became continually at odds with one another and were also undermined from within. And these 3 brothers continually negotiated these conflicting European expansionist interests while working with, and this is also significant, and becoming utterly dependent on indigenous laborers, assistants, translators, and collaborators. So my manuscript will consider these Schlagenweits' attempts to establish their reputations as scientists and explorers within these greater political frameworks, and also local networks of indigenous knowledge and practices.
That's amazing. And it would be really interesting to see the emergence of international collaborative science in the Himalaya. They produced some fine art as well, didn't they, in terms of their illustrations? Some of the first images we have of these regions, correct me if I'm wrong, they got up into Kashmir and traveled into Chinese Central Asia as well? Or?
Yeah. And just this past summer, I was visiting the Bavarian State Library in Munich and was able at an archive to view some of these illustrations. There are over 750. It's quite astonishing.
That's extraordinary. When we were talking with Lachlan Fleetwood recently, we were talking about the East India Company in the first half of the 19th century. And of course, they seemed very reluctant to fund scientific practices. You know, they were always counting the costs and reducing budgets and things like this. And so it was difficult to get funding for collaborative projects like this.
And I think in this case, it became even more tenuous and difficult because then, as I said, that the Prussian king was also involved. And this, again, still went back to Humboldt, who very much supported the Schlagenweits, in part because I think he, at this point, was already kind of at the end of his career and viewed these young, energetic alpinists as kind of the promising new scientists and was really promoting them with a very different agenda, obviously, than the British East India Company. Yeah.
Just before we finish, Caroline, have you got any thoughts you'd be willing to share on what the big challenges are for mountain landscapes, mountain communities around the world? Particularly, are there ways in which you'd like your own work to make a difference to those issues? Because obviously we're interested in mountain stories, but we're also interested in mountain futures. And I mean, one way of putting the question is to say, what's the use of mountain history? What good can it do?
Very good, very good. A big question, a challenging one. But I'm just returning from the International Mountain Conference in Innsbruck, Austria. And I was truly struck by the multitude and the diversity of ongoing mountain research. There were over 150 events with more than 1,000 participants. However, almost every presentation of research focused on the effects of climate change and glaciers, water resources, biodiversity, and sustainable development. And while this work, of course, is eminently important, it is likewise crucial that the humanities are part of this conversation, that we not only research what happens on the mountains and with the mountains, but also the changing ways how humans have related to and interact with mountains. And so what was also very evident in the city of Innsbruck itself, situated right up against the Nordkette Mountains and other mountain ranges. And I think what also you have described so well, Jason, in your book is how mountains are linked to cities and civilizations. So they are not separate entities. And I think this gets us to tackle the question of how we want to relate to the mountains of the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Caroline. It's been great to talk to you today. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for all these engaging questions.
We've got more episodes coming up exploring new perspectives on mountain history, mountain experience. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share the podcast with others. Have a look at our other episodes. You can follow us on social media or get in touch directly via the project website. Just search for Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures, or follow the links in the episode notes. Thanks to Zofia Gertin for editing. Thank you for listening.